So we're really excited to have the opportunity to talk about a subject that is not probably on the forefront of everybody who is developing solar minds, to talk about sheep grazing at solar development, solar properties. So we're very excited to welcome our guest speakers today. So I'm going to read their bios, and then we'll start on. Of course, everybody is very used to the chat, so please put your questions in the chat, and we'll work to address them as appropriate. So if it seems like there's a clarification needed as we're working through the presentation, we'll stop and answer. Otherwise, we can have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So I want to welcome our speakers today. We have our main speaker is Lexie Hain. Lexie is the Executive Director of the American Solar Grazing Association. She is a farm owner in New York State since 2005. Lexie started a small homestead and transitioning to owner and operator of a specialty plant nursery, Mother Plants, from 2005 to 2015. After selling the business in 2015, she transitioned to solar grazing with sheep. By 2020, the grazing business included 5 solar companies as clients. She co-founded the American Solar Grazing Association in 2018. ASGA is a non-for-profit with a goal of promoting best practices in solar grazing. ASGA is the originator of the solar site mapping tool, connecting farmers with solar companies, and that was launched in May 2020. And that URL is solargrazing.org, and we'll send that out with the follow-up. We also want to welcome Trent Hendricks. Trent is a rancher, consultant, and serial entrepreneur, having interest in all things agricultural, food, and environment. Trent has served as a board member for the American Grass-Fed Association, the Grass-Fed Alliance, Propagate Ventures, REP Provisions, and is a Savory Global Advisor. I want to know more about that. Along with an accredited Savory field professional, Trent and his partner Rachel, with their 6 children, own Cabrejo Ranch in Missouri Ozark, where they produce grass-fed beef and lamb, along with operating their ranch as a headquarters for a large grazing operation, including many utility-scale solar farms across Midwest and Southeast states. Trent's passion is reviving rural communities with holistic management and grassland economy. Pretty cool stuff. And then last but not least, I want to welcome Jonathan Barter. Jonathan was raised and educated in the United Kingdom, but calls home a grass-fed sheep and beef operation in upstate New York. Jonathan is currently the Solar Grazing Operations Manager for Delaware River Solar and a community solar developer in New York State. He is spearheading development and vertically integrated sheep grazing operations there. He serves as the president of ASGA, which is the American Solar Grazing Association, since its founding in 2018. He oversees all operations, including the successful operation of the first statewide solar grazing research grant in 2020. Congratulations, Jonathan. So I believe, Lexie, you are going to kick us off today.
Thank you so much, Illinois Sia, Leslie. That was lovely. And we have prepared some slides for you today. What I've learned after being the practitioner for solar grazing for a number of years is that it is truly a picture is 1,000 words. So many of the pictures you'll see here today are of solar sites that I manage, but some are of other ASGA members or other ASGA board members. So just assume that the pictures you're seeing are pictures by and large that were taken at solar sites in the United States in the past 3 years. So letting you know this practice is alive and real. So we're going to sort of work our way through the slides, and next slide, please. Jonathan, Trent, and I have never actually all presented together. Trent is newly on the ASGA board. Thank you, Trent. So we're going to give this a roll. Thanks so much for your patience. And I'll start with a couple more slides and then I'll pass off to one of my colleagues. So just quickly, what is solar grazing? And by our definition, we have determined it is the following: the grazing of the livestock to manage the vegetation at solar arrays. And you can get more complex or simple than that, but by and large, we're talking about sheep as the compatible species with ground-mounted photovoltaics. This picture and many of the pictures here are all taken at solar sites that are standard ground mount. They are not modified specially, meaning the racking is exactly the way the racking was built. I've been asked that now a couple times. So nope, standard ground mount, upstate New York, sheep and solar. Next slide, please. And sort of a couple highlights for you, and I'm expecting our audience here is by and large solar companies operating out of the upper Midwest. So some key highlights if you don't take anything else home today, and that is one, sheep fit. Their size is compatible with ground mounted solar. And not only do they fit, you can kind of see the U there under the panel kind of blinking with the yellow flowers. It serves as shade for them, and it is in fact a perfectly compatible environment for them. Secondly, something called managed grazing, and both the gentlemen I'm with today know a lot about managed grazing. It keeps the sun shining on the panels, which I know is really important to this group. It also, and this is something really important, item 3, if you want to set goals for the site management over the lifetime of your projects, you can set goals that improve the biodiversity, and sheep grazing can help you achieve that. You really can do more with sheep grazing, certainly much more than you could ever do with just mowers alone. And finally, the thing that solar grazing does that is really unique is it forms farmer partnerships with those rural landowners in those rural communities and forms allies for your project. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. I'm gonna, Jonathan, or I'm gonna do this one, and I'm gonna pass to you or Trent for the next one. So quickly, and I stole these pictures from the National Renewable Energy Lab, so I guess it's not technically stealing. Just the dual use scenarios that we currently see in the United States, and you can look at the top 2 that are the most popular in terms of, their ability to roll out and deploy are, with the sheep over grasses, they're describing it, or with the pollinator friendly vegetation. Everything on the bottom, those bottom 3 options are really in the experimental stage, the research phase, so on and so forth. But at scale, what we're seeing are the top 2. And I will finally say there is certainly managed vegetation with sheep where you can manage with those pollinator species. And so now next slide, and I think maybe Jonathan, you want to take a few?
Sure. I think one of the things I was a little unclear about was the composition of the folks at this virtual meeting, because I certainly don't want to be talking about things that are uninteresting or less important, because we can talk about this as a general overview or more specifically as a managed practice. I think sometimes I've heard people talk about or assume that sheep on solar sites versus somebody going in there with a mower a couple of times a year presents a whole level of complications. And do we really want to deal with that? And consequently, the answer is no, let's just go the easy way out. But that isn't necessarily accurate. And I think one of our tasks from ASGA and those of us who practice solar grazing is to try and convince folks that actually it's not that complicated. There are facets to it that require a level of management. But after all, at the end of the day, all we're looking to do is control the vegetation one way or the other. And we're contending that sheep are the most efficient way of doing it. because not only can they graze between the panels, but they can graze under the panels. And to mechanically control vegetation under those panels can be very difficult and problematic. And so actually sheep do it much more efficiently and cheaply. The Lexie's reference to different uses and different livestock types on solar farms is a concept that really needs a lot of research, and I would suggest that it's not terribly compelling at this juncture. I mean, sheep are the perfect ruminant to do this. Folks have said, what about chickens? What about goats? What about rabbits? Well, you know, rabbits may be fine on a 1 acre site, but I'm thinking, how many rabbits can you put on a 1,000 acre site? And how do you manage them? And goats, well, you know, goats are very versatile and they're very non-selective in the vegetation that they prefer. So it seems like they would work quite well, but goats tend to have an interest in everything. And in a situation like you're seeing in this picture here, the goats would be not only looking at those panels and the wires underneath them, but they'd be checking them out orally too, and you're likely to find some damage pretty quickly. Not to mention their ability to jump. And when some of these panels are close to the ground, that can be a problem too. And of course, that brings us around to the whole idea of the potential for damage on these sites. So folks mowing sites, there's a far greater potential for damaging panels with a mower than there is with a gentle, passive sheep wandering around. Well, I mean, you know, the design component of the picture on the right and the height and the width between the panels, my comment on that, frankly, is the importance of designing sites with in terms of how you want to, or what you want to do with a site for management post-construction. It's very clear that not a lot of thought went into design in the early days, and they weren't suitable either for mowing or for maneuvering sheep, or let alone backing trailers in, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we've come a long way, but it is still something to emphasize that the design needs to be compatible with your intended protocols for vegetation management. It makes it that much easier for the person who's going to do it for you. And it makes it much more attractive for the sheep operator too. I think we've exhausted anything on this slide. Anything else, Trent? Would you say?
No, you're spot on. Thanks.
So next slide, please. And Trent, this is your domain, so I'll let you take over here.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm just going to add, Trent, that, and I was going to give you this lead too, was solar grazing, as far as I'm concerned, you know, you can start it at a 1 megawatt size, but at what size can you still solar graze? And that's where I thought you just could lead in with this.
Sure. So, you know, if we have grass, we have sheep that can eat the grass. And, you know, so there's some misnomers out there around the value of grass. And it's important to understand that unless you can just literally open a gate in a pasture and walk across into a solar farm, which there are a few instances where that happens, but that's pretty atypical. And in our case, we're grazing on solar farms across 8 states. Actually, from our furthest point to furthest point, we have about 1,000 miles between solar sites. And so there are very real costs associated with the logistics and mobility of hitting those sites. So would that make sense for a 1 to 5 meg? No, it would not. But there might be a local solution, or there might be some extenuating circumstances that would make that feasible. But for the most part, we focus on the utility scale ones. And as everyone knows, there's some very large projects online and many more in development. And those are the ones that can be really cost effective, particularly if we get in early and we start to support the design team with features that make it more attractive for grazing, such as water, fencing improvements and enhancements, things of that nature. but there's a lot of opportunity, and I think long term we have the opportunity to lower the overall costs for solar farms, solar operators, utilities, by lowering the cost of vegetation. But to Jonathan's point, the damage by an animal is much, much lower, virtually non-existent. And we all know that the mechanical solutions, there's just a built-in factor of damage that needs to be dealt with. It's just the reality of it. So as the industry moves to adopting more and larger utility farms, this becomes very attractive because we can also come in with a lot of additional attributes that conventional veg man will never be able to do. We don't know what the cost of mowing will be in 10 years, but it's probably not going to be less. And we also know that the whole point of renewable energy is to enhance the environment, to decrease the negative impacts of our involvement with the environment, and ultimately to reverse that, to regenerate. And by using livestock and principles surrounding holistic management and scientific methods to evaluate progress, we can actually demonstrate on these large operations how we can not only lower the cost long-term of the project, but also continue to produce food from the acreage, improve water flows, decrease erosion, decrease chemical usage, and have a whole suite of environmentally important attributes that could also be built into ecometrics or a carbon plan long term. So there are additional reasons to look at partnering with progressive producers of sheep that can handle the logistics, handle the mobility, handle the management, and the professionalism to bring in the tools necessary to accomplish the job.
Wow, thanks, Trent. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give a quick 1, 2, 3, what's incompatible with solar grazing. And I tried to keep these as highlights that folks in the solar industry would resonate with. So item 1, these wildlife fences. When you're in your permitting process, think carefully about whether you're going to consider solar grazing as a management tool, because when you select to raise the perimeter fence, such as in this photo, that allows in things like stray dogs or coyotes and potentially allows out any sheep we're trying to keep in there. So for, addressing permitting requirements around wildlife friendly fencing, I have some other ideas. I've seen some other design models, but certainly raising the perimeter fences is not something we recommend. Secondly, if you know you're building on a site with contaminated soils, brownfield sites, simply do some soil tests, and you're going to want to work with your producer on that. It's not an automatic no, it's just what kind of contamination. We just have to think of the well-being of the animals and, their intended use. Are they going to be producing milk? Third, this is a kind of loose phrase, but it's loose dangling wires. And I'm sure you're all seeing now that over the lifetime of these projects with vegetation management, whether it be mowing or grazing, having more wires that are dangling close to the ground, whether they be the module-to-module connectors or loops of wire, as in this brand new site in Pennsylvania, something or someone could snag on that. And if that's hot, that's a problem. So I just sort of encourage in general better wire management over the lifetime of these projects. A little bit tighter, a little bit of sleeving up front might save for an accident later. Lastly, most people here aren't thinking about CSP, so we're not really going to discuss it. But no, CSP and sheep grazing probably not compatible, but that's just the nature of that product. Next slide.
Can I just jump in on that slide again?
Yeah.
So that the bottom slide there with all the brown vegetation and just a little bit of green. Yes, it could be contaminated soils, but it could very likely too that somebody sprayed a chemical on all that weeds to kill the weeds, to control the vegetation, which is theoretically or technically another means of control. But I guess I would proffer the question, how does that look for PR? I know that in agricultural practice, no-till farming, which I'm certainly a supporter of, usually involves spraying fields before they plant to kill off any vegetation. And for those brief days or possibly weeks before the new crop emerges, you see these big brown fields with all the dead vegetation, and you think, oh my goodness, there's something wrong here. Well, in a case where they're farming the ground and they're growing corn or soybeans or whatever it may be, something comes up and makes it green again. But in a case like this, that area could be brown for a long time, and I think it's just I'm just trying to emphasize that is not a very acceptable way to control vegetation. We just had some communication from someone with an ASGA, I forget which state it was, who is looking at a fairly sizable, I think it was a 500-acre site that up till now has been sprayed with a herbicide, and there's no green vegetation at this point. Well, obviously it's going to be probably reseeded and grazed by sheep now, we hope, which will massively change the aesthetics of that site. And that's really something to consider, particularly when these solar sites are becoming more and more under the public eye, under the scrutiny of folks. We want them to see something that looks good, or something that looks awful like that. Okay.
Jonathan, I would like to build on that just briefly, and I know this is in danger of going down a rabbit trail, but to your point about spraying and having the bare ground, to solar developers and solar property owners, there's a huge aspect that is very rarely talked about. And when you do not have a living ground cover, it is only a matter of time until you have erosion. Enough erosion leads to civil repairs. It costs a lot of money. Almost every site has some within 5 years of going online. And the increased potential for damage of doing dirt work, civil work around existing panels is greatly heightened. With proper land management, which includes grazing animals, we can stabilize those soils, leading to a much lower incidence of erosion, if any at all. And we have very specific experience on utility scale sites that we're managing where we have utilized the animal impact intentionally to correct real erosion, minimal erosion, by feeding animals on that site to tie waste hay and seed into those beginning real erosions and stabilizing transition sites and utility scales. Conventional land management potentially leads to additional civil work through erosion, etc. Properly designed and implemented grazing systems correct them and prevent them. So these are real numbers, hard to quantify. They tend to be a soft line item because it's very difficult to prove, but it is something as the sites get larger and larger and the costs get bigger and bigger. These are important details that there are so many additional attributes and benefits from a correctly designed and implemented grazing operation than we could ever potentially perceive with chemicals or mechanical. It's a simple line expense when you use a conventional veg man, and there is no additional value coming out of mowing or chemicals. On the other hand, we can, at comparable prices and sometimes lower prices, achieve the same outcomes with a whole suite of additional attributes that come at no additional cost or minimal additional cost. So just wanted to build on what you were saying there because I think you're 100% correct.
Next slide, please. So because I'm expecting a mostly solar company audience and I got a couple of questions in advance, I just wanted to sort of broad brush highlights on like what are the risks or what are the benefits around solar grazing, perhaps with your lens. One thing that I think you're all very aware of is that there's not enough data points out there publicly. So on our website, we have a research tab, and anything I'm going to be referencing in this presentation is now under that research tab. So that includes this first NREL study that probably some of you caught, but it talks about, it's the first kind of high level study of the capital costs around dual use PV. So their argument was PV plus grazing reduced some of the site preparation costs, but then what they saw was a slight increase with the addition of wells. Obviously, the assumption there that wells would go in on all sites. I have seen plenty of solar sites now where you can also tie into municipal water, for example. So that's not an added cost. Just quickly, we have a first set of data points, and solar grazing comes in on the upfront side, very, very close, compatible to traditional solar. And I think with a little planning, a lot of it is a very much like a no cost, low cost kind of change. What we're going to see more of, and we have a little bit of data on, is the solar PV performance with solar grazing. The first Cornell study that was put out in 2019 did have a survey aspect component where they found no issues or damage or anyone getting hurt with solar grazing on the solar sites. ASGA is going to conduct a much larger study. We have been funded by NYSERDA in New York State, and that will launch a much bigger, more in-depth research study into this, over 30 solar sites. But that's a couple of years from publication. Just a couple other quick high-level details, and certainly Trent or Jonathan can speak to some of these. Biosecurity, this is something where you're going to be hiring a professional to do this. You're going to be moving, livestock across state lines. Trent handles all that stuff. There are state veterinarians, there are all kinds of things where there are regulations. Someone like me or Jonathan or Trent knows what they are, and we follow them. They're not particularly onerous. They're just boxes to check and a couple phone calls, but they exist. The next thing is, and we're kind of switching more to other positives, there's definitely a site security benefit to hiring a grazer instead of hiring a landscaping firm. And one major reason for that is that we grazers become the face of your project. We become the face of your project in that neighborhood or community. We are there very often. We're checking on our animals. We're checking to see how the site is doing. We're checking to see how the vegetation is growing. So when we're there, the neighbors get to know us. I mean, I've gotten to know neighbors in all kinds of parts of the Finger Lakes now because I'm there and I'm checking on my sheep. And so what that means for your sites is that presence, and we also start to represent your firm, and that's a good thing. It kind of combats that absentee neighbor or absentee landowner issue. And then just the last two, and again, the places like NRCS, places like usually your state agriculture departments have standards around all of this, but something like sheep manure won't be a problem with good management. So good rotational grazing, good planned management means that manure actually means improved soil health and translates in the end to a healthier, much greater biodiversity than you could have otherwise. And then secondly, sheep are alive and sometimes sheep die. So just means, again, you're working with professionals and they have a plan. You have a compost that you take the animal to. So it happens. It doesn't happen very often. That was also part of the first Cornell study, but it can happen. I don't know if Jonathan or Trent want to follow on that, or we could go to the next slide with comparing to other management regimes.
I think, yeah, maybe seeing as this is a recurring subject, the management concerns, the sheep manure, because we have already encountered a few, maybe I shouldn't say objections, but certainly concerns about nutrients and runoff of nutrients, and is sheep on these solar sites going to contribute towards water pollution, contamination, which are not entirely ridiculous objections or concerns. But I think the need on our part is to try and reassure folks that firstly, good grazing, we keep trying to emphasize good grazing, well-managed grazing. And I think the three of us are using that term or versions of it, because that is very important. The antithesis of good grazing is what we call overgrazing, when you've got far too many animals on far too few acres. And what you end up having is what we call the golf course effect or the putting green effect, and there's no vegetation. And so when rain comes, the rain washes straight directly off the field. And when there's nutrients, when there's manure on that ground, and the rain comes, then that nutrient is washed directly off the field, the site, and potentially can enter into waterways, water bodies, aquifers, drainage ditches, etc., etc. So yes, it is a concern. So it's one more reason that good management is imperative, and good management will certainly offset any concerns about nutrient migration and contamination down the road. I think the body of data is gradually growing, and we've got masses of data on grazing over the last several decades, and how it has contributed to improved soil structure, as Trent already made reference to. And we can only assume that that same scenario will be replicated by grazing on solar sites. We are, as Lexie mentioned, doing a project that will contribute to that body of data that will, I hope, make the case that we're containing carbon, that we're secreting nutrients, that we're making things better and not worse. It's not static. It's a rapidly evolving, growing ecology when it's done right. Next. Most of these speak for themselves, right? The undesirables. I remember last year we were looking at how weeds at all can impact the efficiency of a photovoltaic array, and of course that picture up in the top right is a pretty extreme version, but it does indicate that you can spray a certain amount or mow a certain amount, but it's really hard to get to that vegetation right underneath those panels, and that's when you start to get scenarios like this. But what I did learn is that just weeds growing over the edge of the lowest panel in that line can actually affect the efficiency of that whole row of panels. So it doesn't take too much calculation to realize that weeds, and depending on where those panels are at the lowest point, and often it's less than 30 inches, it can very quickly impact that site's efficiency. So for soil developers, that's a big no-no, because you invest a lot of money in these things, and once you start to lose efficiency, you lose production and consequently revenue. And well, you always see extreme pictures to demonstrate what can happen under the worst case scenarios. And of course, that erosion there in the middle picture on the bottom is a sad picture, but that does happen when construction takes place under very unfavorable conditions, which happens a lot. 2019 was a particularly bad year in New York for things like that. It was very difficult to get seed on the ground, to get it to cover the ground and protect the ground. So the ground was very vulnerable. And if we consider the soil to be a valuable commodity to conserve, well, we do not want to see that because we're losing soil by the boatload in scenarios like that. The broken panels, we've probably all seen that. Very not uncommon at all when you're mowing sites, and there may be a few loose stones here and there, and they get thrown around rather viciously. Anything else there, Lexie? Or Trent?
I was just going to say that the picture in the bottom center was it was winter. I took that picture at winter time at a solar site in North Carolina, where you can see it's a mowing only regime, and just that turf grass has very shallow roots, and it couldn't stabilize the site during a storm event. I mean, I just happened to be driving past, actually. So if you plant with a greater, anyway, just thoughtfulness around your planting and your management, and you should be able to avoid situations like that.
And not wanting to labor any points, but the benefits of being proactive from the very beginning of a project in its development and planning comes down to little details like what kind of grass are we going to seed here, because the typical kind of grass is a very generic grass that never grows very tall, which is fine if you're going to mow it, but it's certainly not very helpful for managing and feeding animals. But I think the point is to be thoughtful about what you're going to seed on that site. Don't just go to your local store and pick up a few bags of a contractor's mix, because that may be entirely inappropriate and unhelpful. We could talk a lot about that. I don't want to belabor the point. I think the point is to be thoughtful and proactive upfront about what you're going to do when that site is completed.
I think next slide, just quickly, you're all aware of this trend. Most of the solar isn't built yet. And then we can go to the following slide. And this is a state map that we've made. I've been making this map for 3 years now. It's been very fun for me to fill in the colors, so to speak. You know, in some states, there might be a single solar site still, but in many states, it's thousands of acres of solar grazing. So just pointing out that it is becoming an industry. As solar grows, we are seeing the solar grazing industry grow. So just noting that if you actually then look at an overlay of where project development is, it lines up pretty well. But knowing that it is materially happening in these states, and in some cases at many thousands of acres at a time. Trent, do you have any comment on this?
I think, but just before Trent jumps in, I think I just read this week that West Virginia has just had an approved site for solar for either for 2022, I believe.
Yep. I read the same thing.
I would just add that the growth is forecasted, it's planned for, it's going to happen. The question is, how do we most economically and with the greatest overall beneficial outcomes manage the land that is going to be assigned to solar? And keeping energy security at the top of the list is very important. So is food security, and so is the stewardship of our resources. And the beautiful thing is well-managed, and I emphasize well-managed, professional producers can contribute significantly to achieving that triple bottom line and all those benefits that are typically at the driving root of why we're making a shift to solar power in the first place. We help put the finishing touches, as it were, on renewable energy.
Next slide. So this is a Cornell study that is now several years old, but like we all know, there's not enough data points, but these are some. And the point of this is that solar grazers are paid, and to get solar grazing done right, it's imperative that they are paid properly. And because it is there's a real set of work and a real set of expenses for that grazer, and that to achieve your outcomes, such as, you know, good erosion control and keeping the sun on the panels, you know, meeting those expectations. So quickly on this study, the reason New York State looks like the best place to solar graze in part is because we did have a lot of the DG, the sort of smaller 50 acre and less sites. And so that means we charge more per acre because we have to. To travel further to go to somewhere that's smaller, I have to charge more. So does everyone else. And there were utility scale sites in other states that contributed to those figures. You should also be aware that many ASGA members contributed figures to the NREL study that will be coming out. I've been told it'll be published soon. So NREL will have it on their website. We will post it as soon as we have it. But I think it'll be a second, really much broader set of data. So I'm looking forward to that. And you should also know that we are working internally as an organization to do things like build out enterprise budgets for other people who are getting into this business, because that's also very important. Tied to that, next slide, is the idea of farm viability. And certainly, you know, here I am on the East Coast where, especially down towards the city, farmland is at a premium, but markets are very close. So there's a study that, in fact, the release of the study was this morning by the Institute for Energy and the Environment. And they did a first look at what happens to farms in terms of farm viability when you put solar on a portion of the land. And they explored the study in many different ways, with many different scenarios for Maryland. But I think you can extrapolate on this and say that we should probably be doing this kind of work in concert with places like the American Farmland Trust, perhaps, to really explore what solar and then solar plus solar grazing does for family farms. I think that's going to be really important for messaging. Jonathan or Trent, do you want to say anything?
I think I'd be interested to hear Trent's perspective from the West.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to contribute to that. We haven't seen a lot of farms that have solar as a part of the home farm component, but we do see a huge value in being able to expand the capabilities of farms for bringing on the next generation, or for being able to avoid off-farm revenue streams by utilizing the skill sets and resources they have to operate the home farm. So we see it as a great contributor to farm income. It's a non-traditional revenue source, but it makes perfect sense because it's simply a force multiplier based off of existing skill sets and assets that can be applied to grazing solar farms as well. So we do see it as a huge opportunity. Again, for example, in my own family ranch operation, it's allowed us to expand more rapidly and make room for our older children to join our family business full time. That would not maybe have been impossible otherwise, but this certainly was a very timely and very attractive and beneficial opportunity to create room for the children to join the business.
Yeah. Well said.
There's another again, a recurring point, because the further on we go with what we're doing, there's certain questions that seem to come up continually, and one of them has been, well, with all these solar sites, and we're going to put all these sheep on these solar sites, aren't we going to have too many sheep eventually? And the simple answer to that is no, at least not for a long time, because at this juncture, for those of you who don't know, at least 50 plus to 55%, even the figure, I'm not sure, of the lamb that's consumed in this country is imported from outside, particularly from Australia. So there's an enormous amount of lamb that we could produce at home and supply our own market, which would be beneficial. I think we could mostly agree on. So there's lots of room for growing the sheep industry. So I don't think we're gonna hit that, really affect that number too much in the foreseeable future.
Next slide. So we can just touch on this a little bit lightly because we've actually covered a bunch of this, but the general idea is when you're planning solar grazing, much less like you're planning the rest of your solar project, we just suggest that, if you know you're going to work with a participating farmer, certainly you'll want to bring them into the fold a little earlier for best results. And, certainly work with them on things like the design review. Like we talked about, a lot of this doesn't have to cost more, but something as simple as figuring out where the gates of the project might be so that you could plan the flow of sheep from one part of your solar site to the next part might save your operator a lot of work later. So just simple things. And then there's something called a grazing plan, and this is something that, you know, most operators should know about and what it is, and you can get them from, anyway, you can get them built for each one of your projects, and it often can be locally done or done by someone from the NRCS, but it's simply a plan for just making sure that the management of the vegetation is done at your solar sites. And then lastly, and we have these on our website, we have solar grazing contracts. We have them free of charge. We worked on them collaboratively with many solar companies and grazers, and they're in template form, so they're easy to use. So they're a free resource, and you can use them if you're gonna, and they're also pretty all-encompassing. We kind of built them out a little heavy so that you can sort of say everybody in legal is happy, and then maybe reduce them a little bit. But just saying, there are some tools, and we don't want it to be intimidating, but they're out. Some of them we already provide, and they're free. Next, please. So actually, Jonathan, I might let you take this up, but this slide to me highlights what an operator might do if they're planning to own their own solar projects, such as your firm.
Yeah. So I'll simply say, you know, once again, the well-worn phrase already has been well-managed grazing, and well-managed grazing in any scenario, whether it's on solar sites or not, is by enabling the plants that are being grazed to rest and recover. That's the sort of simple principle. And at different times of the growing season, that time frame will vary. It may vary from 15 days to 50 days. And if you encroach on that, you will undermine the health of the plant and its ultimate productivity. All that to say that breaking up a site or a field into smaller pieces, paddocks we call them sometimes, is beneficial, so you can move your animals around, whatever kind of animals you have, in this case sheep. So we create paddocks on the site. And obviously this slide shows that we're using what we would call permanent interior fence. A lot of folks have wondered about the viability of that. Isn't that expensive, they'll say? Can you justify the cost? What I'm doing is a little bit different to what some other folks are doing, because we own these sites, and frankly, I put these fences in as cheaply as I possibly could. Not to say it isn't cheap. It isn't cheap, but it costs something. Alternatively, and we could talk about the alternatives of fencing, and that is using temporary fence. And there are various options of temporary fence, particularly electrified netting, which several manufacturers use now. And it's a very popular way to either create fields or paddocks within paddocks, and works very well with small ruminants, particularly sheep and goats. And the other slide on the left there is water. And water is the single limiting issue on any site that has to be addressed. And sometimes it's very obvious by where the nature where the site is. It's its proximity to a stream, to a pond, etc. But very often, and probably more often than not, immediately available water source within that site. So we have to figure out what are we going to do for the smaller operations that are fairly close to where the producer is. Well, it's usually fairly viable to haul water. But hauling water, and I know that Trent will re-echo this, is generally completely non-feasible unless you're paying somebody for a lot of time spent hauling water from two sites. And I've done a little bit of that, and it's a pain in the neck. So the viability of drilling wells on the site becomes an expense that is arguably worthwhile investing in. I have also spent some time with some of the sites that we are constructing to talk to the landowners who may be farmers, not necessarily, and who may have existing water systems in place that we can tap into. And we've done that very successfully on several occasions, and just develop an agreement or a contract with them too. So can't overemphasize the importance of water and the need to have it. You cannot graze sheep without water from somewhere.
what I might do for the next few slides, Jonathan and Trent, is we'll just go through them kind of quickly because of time, but just let people know that, you know, different people, this is one of the stories of evolution where people in different places have each done really significant amounts of research onto what the right way to approach this is. But I would say that to such a young industry, you know, these are suggestions of what other people have done, and in some cases appropriate for their site in Canada or Kansas or Michigan. So just here are some highlights. So I might go through them quickly if that's cool. Next, yeah, here, clean water, a must. They've got to have it. Sometimes you can collect it on site. Certainly if you own your sites, you might want to. Hauling it, less fun. So finding out an alternative for the long run is going to be important for managed grazing. Next. Good perimeter fences, depending on what you perceive a predator threat might be very well worth doing. I know a number of large utilities who have invested in really decent fences. You already have to do fences. You might as well just make sure they're put in well, and it will make things a little bit nicer for your grazer, and also in the long run definitely save you money. Next, please. Some people, this is kind of actually the prettiest example of a photo I have, like to exclude their equipment pads from the sheep. Sometimes sheep like to lie on equipment pads. Other times they really don't. It's hard for me to be in the sheep's brain, but certainly this is probably the more expensive approach. There are cheaper ways of approaching it, but in terms of, you know, wanting to exclude them from any areas where they can just like lie near your equipment and the intake fans, probably a good idea. Next. And simply just knowing that we do not expect the sheep to eat outside the perimeter fences. So for a variety of reasons, such as the landscaping trees, but also it's just not safe. So know that folks like myself, Trent and Jonathan, we have people mow outside the fences. It's better all around. I did want to, and we have another couple ones. We have an interior fencing picture next, I believe. So if you don't have those nice interior fences, that like at Jonathan's site, then, you know, there are these temporary fences that your grazers can put up. These should be fine. They don't interfere with any kind of electrical currents. But they are something that, you know, when you're talking to your electrical techs, you might want to just, like I simply just have a relationship with electrical techs for my sites and sort of say, this is how you turn the fence on, this is how you turn the fence off. Up to you. A lot of grazers are using these, but they do take more time and they put more of the expense on your farmer. So that can be maybe not a great thing always. And then I actually wanted to address the question in the chat and then maybe we'll go to the next slide. Next slide. And the question in the chat is about liability. I own my farm and so I have farm insurance, and then in addition, I carry liability insurance for my vehicles, and I carry liability insurance for my grazing business. And I go through a regular onboarding process with all the solar companies that I work with. Trent or Jonathan, do you want to speak to that?
We carry suitable policies to meet the needs of all of our clients.
I'd carry on. We're running out of time, and we need to have some questions too, maybe.
Yeah. So if the fences aren't, this is just a picture I have of just modifications again to the perimeter fences that in these cases, two of the cases I've made to just keep the neighborhood dogs out of my solar arrays. And the other thing is, and this is an EDF solar site in Canada. It's been managed with grazing for 4 years. In their case, they solved the perimeter fence issue a different way, and they actually keep livestock guardian dogs in with the sheep. And that's actually been a very successful project for all parties involved. There's a question in from Leslie. Do you see that, Trent? What is the potential liability for the solar facility for any harm that may happen to the animals?
That would be typically handled in the contract.
And Lewis Butler, you have a question about tax benefits. I would love to see tax benefits for supporting farmers and grazing operations. I am not aware of any, but I would be very supportive of any efforts to talk about that. Why don't we go ahead a slide? So this is a little bit of what solar grazing mechanics might look like. Just the assumption is that you're bringing your sheep from, for example, your home farm to a solar site in the spring. And you might graze your sheep out there, manage the vegetation, and then move them to the next solar site or move them within the solar site. It depends on the size of the site. And for example, I have a sheepdog I use, a couple actually, to help me move my sheep around. So it's actually very much like traditional like sheep herding in this way. And all of these things, just also saying have expenses. So just like if you're going to hire a landscaper, they have to have trucks and trailers and all of that. So do we. Next slide. So just to give you a sense of who our members are, we are divided, ASGA is divided into members who are farmers, members who are solar companies, and then a small set of people who are things like, researchers, solar advocacy groups, so on and so forth. But to give you a sense of the kind of people getting into this, you have family farmers, such as the one above, who have been able to diversify their income and now are very much, able to speak out about their support for building out solar in Pennsylvania. Next slide. You have people who are full-time solar grazers who support themselves entirely on their solar grazing business. So there are material businesses being built out this way. This woman was actually able to just build a new barn with her solar grazing income because she's planning to serve even more sites in New Jersey, which is amazing because not many people are building out their farming operations in New Jersey these days. Next slide. And this was I threw this in also, Trent, in part for you, because here's a utility scale solar site actually in South America. It's an Invenergy site, La Quinta Solar, but it's been managed now for a number of years with merino sheep, fully integrated and managed by FRV, the Spanish firm. But just to give you a sense that solar grazing is happening in other places successfully and at scale, the Australians have come out, the Clean Energy Council there has come out with a big case study that they're releasing a report on in March 2021. So just know this is not just like a small phenomenon for a couple farms. This is something real and material, and people are working out the mechanics all around the world. Next slide. And lastly, another kind of business that some of you are probably familiar with, Carolina Solar Services. They offer, the full vegetation management, and they have a flock of sheep they use predominantly for that for DG Solar in North Carolina and Oregon. And then they also do the full electrical, mechanical, and civil work. So I thought that was another kind of interesting business model we're seeing develop. Trent or Jonathan, you want to say anything else about this, or should we kind of fly through?
I went back to some questions, and there was a question that was asked earlier that I was going to address, but I will just go through the rest of the slides, Lex.
Okay, I'll just sort of cruise through these. Oh, this is a picture of one of the solar sites I manage and what it looks like in the summer, just to give you a sense of like the flow and management of the animals as we move around. And it'll be my 4th year managing the site, and it's going fine. We're expanding every year. It's really marvelous. Next slide. There could be a whole other talk on what agriculture is compatible with solar grazing, but just note that similar to our solar grazing contracts, we are going to be offering solar beekeeping contracts that we've built out probably be this summer. But you're probably aware of the pollinator scorecards. Beekeeping is one way to get some points, and certainly like good practices with grazing often mean there's plenty of nectar and forage for those bees. So one way to support that is to get a solar beekeeper, and we have, we're doing our bit to support that. That's probably the easiest way to also, earn other farm income, is to have beekeeping on your solar sites. Next slide. The other thing that I don't see as often, but I would love to see more of, is solar sites designed for haymaking as well. I think that obviously the terrain has to be compatible as well. But if you are able to make some hay on a solar site, like my friends in Ontario are, it really gives that O&M manager a little more flexibility. It also offsets other costs and gives you a little bit more certainty that if you can get a little bit more of that equipment in there, it will give you some more management flexibility. All right, our last few slides are just more about our work. We've touched on some of this, but also know that we did develop a seed mix that's really a template with Ernst Conservation Seeds, a seed house in Pennsylvania that has the ability to help meet pollinator scorecards, provide good food for the sheep, and also work with the height restraints and shade provided by solar. Next slide. We also provide the first ever kind of linking tool between farmers and solar companies with our solar grazing mapping tool. So if you become an ASGA member, you can put a map on the map dot on the map. It's also an app, which you can see right there. So it's our cool little tech tool that came out this fall, and people are populating it. So know that as this is building out as an industry, there's already an app, and you can, list yourself on there and make contact in your area as you're developing your projects. Next. Lastly, just know that, we do, a lot of us, all of us, we're doing most of this out of the generosity of our hearts, and we are, in fact, still a very new not-for-profit. So we are putting on monthly webinars. We are trying to develop a nice repository of information on this practice, as well as just responsible vegetation management at solar sites. We have a lot of collaborative research partners and strategic partners. Some of them are listed on that slide. And we have a member forum where we have open forums and chats, and we welcome you to join and participate. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And thank you to my co-hosts.
Oh my gosh, that was fascinating and refreshing to see all the green in where I am, at least, the snowy Chicago area. I thank you so much to Lexie and Trent and Jonathan for taking time today to educate us on this opportunity. This webinar was recorded, and so we will send it out to the participants, but we'll also have it up on the website for folks to find if they were not able to join us today. And thanks to everybody who was able to stick a little over time. I know that can be tough with folks' schedules, but I'm hoping, Lexie, that we will have the opportunity for our paths to cross more often as solar grazing opportunities increase here in the Midwest, and specifically here in Illinois. So thanks, everybody, for your time and your great attention today. Take care.
Thank you.